The wind came in off the channel with a sharpness that cut through coats and scarves alike. The sea below pounded restlessly at the jagged rocks, its spray carried high enough to touch the road as the motorcar rounded the final bend. Tommy Beresford leaned forward in his seat, squinting through the gathering dusk. "There she is," he announced with the air of a man presenting a prize find. "Seaview Hotel, just as advertised. Old world charm, bracing sea air, and apparently an unbeatable fish pie on Fridays." Beside him, Tuppence adjusted her hat against the gusts that slipped through the gap in the window. She gazed at the silhouette ahead, a once grand Victorian hotel perched precariously above the waves, its gables outlined by the faint glow of lamps in the lobby windows. "It looks as though the sea's been gnawing at its foundation since it was built," she observed dryly. "If that fish pie isn't nailed down, it may already have been washed away." They pulled into a gravel forecourt where the single gas lamp flickered uncertainly against the wind. The hotel's stone facade bore the wear of salt and years, but its arched entrance still carried a certain dignity. A porter hurried forward, tugging at his cap as he opened the car door. "Welcome to the Seaview, sir, madam," he said, his voice almost drowned by the crash of waves below. Inside, the lobby offered blessed warmth. A fire glowed in a brass grate, and the scent of beeswax polish clung faintly to the wooden panels. Behind a high desk stood the manager, Mr. Hargreaves, tall, thin, his spectacles glinting as though they alone had kept the place respectable. He inclined his head with careful courtesy. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, I presume? We've been expecting you. Welcome to our little haven by the sea." "A haven?" murmured Tuppence under her breath, her eyes taking in the threadbare carpet and the faintly damp corners. Aloud, she said brightly, "We're delighted to be here. A holiday by the sea is just what we needed." Hargreaves's smile did not quite reach his eyes. "Ah, yes. The sea air does wonders for the health. You'll find our guests very, how shall I put it, select." As if to demonstrate, the lounge door opened and a woman swept out, draped in widow's black despite the years that had evidently passed since her bereavement. Diamonds flashed at her wrist as she acknowledged them with a faint inclination of the head. "Lady Cranley," Mr. Hargreaves said with pride, "a long-standing guest. She always takes the best suite when she's down from town." Behind her followed a younger man carrying a sketch-pad under one arm, his hair falling untidily over his forehead. He offered a shy smile. "Our resident artist," Hargreaves explained. "Mr. Peter Latham. Very promising. He tells me the cliffs inspire him." Last came a stocky figure with a clipped moustache and a habit of glaring at the world as though it were perpetually out of order. His voice was brisk as he addressed Hargreaves. "That room of mine needs more hot water. Blast it. A man can't shave in lukewarm trickles." "Colonel Fortescue," the manager said smoothly, as though the complaint were part of the man's introduction. Tuppence, who had met many colonels in her time, needed no further explanation. Their bags were carried upstairs, and soon they found themselves in a chamber with tall windows overlooking the restless sea. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture sturdy but tired, yet the view was dramatic, a sweep of waves battering the cliffs beneath a bruised sky. "I told you," Tommy said with satisfaction. "What more could you want than a hotel perched above the channel?" "Perhaps one perched a little more securely," Tuppence returned. She drew her shawl tighter, feeling a draught that hinted at cracks in the window frame. That evening the guests assembled in the dining room, where the long mahogany table bore silver candlesticks and starched napkins. The wind moaned faintly down the chimney, but the lamps gave the scene a warm glow. Lady Cranley presided with an air of command, recounting anecdotes about her late husband's parliamentary career. The colonel interjected gruff remarks, usually about the incompetence of someone long dead. Peter Latham sketched distractedly on the corner of a menu, his replies vague and absent-minded. Tuppence, watching keenly, noticed currents beneath the surface. Lady Cranley's remarks occasionally held barbed edges aimed at the colonel. The colonel's impatience extended not only to the service but to Peter's absent ways, and Peter himself, though polite, seemed to avoid Lady Cranley's gaze with an almost guilty determination. Conversation turned to the weather, then to politics, and finally to the sea itself. "Treacherous," Lady Cranley declared. "It has swallowed many an unwary visitor, but it's magnificent. One feels alive standing on the cliffs." "A man can handle cliffs," the colonel muttered. It's the damp in this hotel that'll do for us all." Laughter followed, though not entirely easy. Tuppence leaned closer to Tommy. "Do you notice? Everyone here seems to have unfinished business with everyone else." Tommy grinned. "My dear girl, that's the charm of seaside hotels. Nothing to do but quarrel, gossip, and pretend one enjoys the food." Yet the fish pie, when it arrived, proved as good as advertised. Even the Colonel fell briefly silent, though he resumed his complaints as soon as his plate was cleared. The evening seemed set to pass in that mixture of mild bickering and polite civility common to English dining rooms, until a ripple of unease spread down the table. A chair at the far end remained conspicuously empty. A place had been laid, silver gleaming, napkin folded, but no guest occupied it. "Miss Stanmore has not joined us," Mr. Hargreaves remarked, his tone too light to be entirely natural. One of the chambermaids, passing with a tray, leaned close to Tuppence and whispered, "Her door's locked, miss, and nobody answers." Tuppence's eyes met Tommy's across the table. For all his bantering tone earlier, she saw the flicker of alertness there, the recognition that something, however small, had shifted. The wind rattled the windows just then, and the waves roared up against the cliff below, as if to underscore the unease that had settled over the Seaview Hotel. Morning broke grey and sullen over the coast, the kind of light that leaches colour from the sea and makes the cliffs loom like slabs of iron. A mist hung low, clinging to the windows of the Seaview Hotel, and the persistent crash of the tide below had not abated since the night before. Tuppence stood at the tall window of their room, gazing down at the restless surf. "There's something about the sea that never quite rests, isn't there?" she murmured. "Always pressing, always reminding us that it can take what it wants." Tommy, who was struggling with the kettle that wheezed more than it boiled, gave her a half-smile. "That's a cheery start to the morning. You've been reading too many sensation novels." But Tuppence's eyes were not on the sea alone. She was thinking of the empty chair at dinner, the chambermaid's whispered words about a locked door. There had been no sign of Miss Beatrice Stanmore the previous evening, and no explanation offered beyond Hargreaves's vague murmur that some guests prefer to dine privately. By the time they came down for breakfast, the hotel's dining room was a little theatre of nerves. Lady Cranley was seated regally at her accustomed place, but her voice carried more stridently than usual, as though attempting to fill a gap. Peter Latham, the young artist, poked absently at his kippers, his eyes shadowed as though he'd scarcely slept. Colonel Fortescue attacked his bacon with military precision, but every so often his gaze flickered towards the doorway. "Is Miss Stanmore unwell?" Tuppence asked lightly, settling into her chair. The question, though gently posed, produced an odd silence. Mr. Hargreaves, who had just entered with a sheaf of post, cleared his throat. "Miss Stanmore, it seems she did not sleep in her bed last night. The maid reports the sheets quite untouched." Lady Cranley gave a little gasp, one hand to her pearls. "My dear Hargreaves, surely you're not suggesting anything improper?" "No, madam, merely reporting the fact." Peter Latham dropped his fork with a clatter. "Perhaps she went out early to sketch. The cliffs are very fine at dawn." The Colonel snorted. "Sketching before breakfast? Rubbish! Spinster ladies don't creep about the headlands in the dark. Most likely she's paying a morning call somewhere she oughtn't." "Colonel!" Lady Cranley's eyes flashed, but her outrage had more of performance than sincerity about it. Tuppence leaned towards Tommy. "Do you notice? They're all too quick with explanations." Tommy raised his brows. "It's a seaside hotel. People vanish into their own pursuits all the time. You're reading more into this than there is." But when the chambermaid appeared at the Colonel's elbow, her face pale, the atmosphere shifted from gossip to alarm. "Sir, Mr. Hargreaves, please come. Miss Stanmore's room. There's something not right." Within minutes the little party had trooped upstairs, Tommy and Tuppence included. The corridor smelled faintly of damp plaster, the wallpaper peeling near the skirting. At the end, Miss Stanmore's door stood ajar. Inside, the room was disturbingly neat. The bed lay untouched, the curtains drawn half across the windows. On the dressing table, a single teacup lay broken, its handle snapped cleanly away, as though crushed in a sudden grip. More curious still, a faint perfume lingered in the air, sweet, powdery, and beneath it, unmistakable, the briny tang of seawater. "Good Lord," Tommy murmured, stooping to examine the shards. "Did she throw it, do you think?" Or did someone else break it? Tuppence countered. She bent, running a finger lightly along the wood of the sill. It came away damp. The sea's been in here somehow. Smell it? Salt and tide mixed with scent. That doesn't come from the breakfast tray. Mr. Hargreaves tugged fretfully at his cuffs. No luggage appears missing. Her case is still packed. Perhaps she went for a walk and was delayed. Lady Cranley gave a sharp laugh. Nonsense. At her age, and without her spectacles, she'd have broken her neck on the stairs. All eyes turned to the dressing table where, sure enough, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles rested neatly atop a folded handkerchief. Colonel Fortescue bristled. Well, what of it? The police can sort it out. She'll have wandered to a neighbour's cottage and lost her way. The police, when summoned, proved less than eager. The local inspector, a heavy-set man smelling of tobacco, listened to Hargreaves's recital with visible impatience. A lady takes herself off for a walk by the sea. Happens often enough. If she doesn't turn up by evening, we'll search the cliffs. But there's nothing here to suggest foul play. Tuppence's eyes narrowed. Except that she left without her spectacles, without her luggage, without even touching her bed, and except for the broken cup and the scent of seawater in the room. The inspector shrugged. Might have been careless. As for seawater, the whole place smells of it. Comes in through the cracks. With that unhelpful reassurance, he tramped off, leaving the guests to their unease. Back in the lounge, the discussions began in earnest. Lady Cranley wrung her hands theatrically. It's dreadful. Simply dreadful. That poor woman, though I never cared for her manner, mind you, gone without a trace. Peter Latham's voice trembled. Perhaps she had enemies. People sometimes misunderstand. The Colonel glowered at him. Speak plain, man. What do you mean by that? Nothing. Nothing at all. He buried himself once more in his sketch pad, but his pencil scratched nervously, producing only jagged lines. Tuppence, watching keenly, thought the young man looked far more shaken than his words suggested. Later, as she and Tommy strolled the draughty corridor, Tuppence lowered her voice. Lady Cranley protests too much, if you ask me. All that pearl clutching. And did you notice how quickly she declared Miss Stanmore couldn't possibly have gone walking? Or perhaps she's simply being sensible, Tommy replied. Not everyone leaps to murder when someone oversleeps. Then what of Peter Latham? He looked as though he'd seen a ghost. And the Colonel, bullying bluster, trying to close down the subject before it's opened. No, Tommy, I'll tell you this. Miss Stanmore didn't leave of her own accord. Something happened here in this hotel last night. Tommy sighed, but there was affection in it. My dear Tuppence, I married you knowing you'd never let a mystery pass unprodded. Very well, we'll keep our eyes open, but for the moment, let's have some toast. One can't investigate on an empty stomach. Yet as they descended the staircase, the building itself seemed to echo Tuppence's unease. Every board creaked underfoot as though repeating secrets. The draughts carried whispers from unseen corners. And beyond the lobby, the closed doors of the east wing waited, shut off under the pretext of repairs, but suggestive of unused rooms and silent corridors where anything might be hidden. The Seaview Hotel had revealed its first mystery. A guest vanished without trace. But Tuppence, sharp-eyed and restless, sensed that the true story of Miss Beatrice Stanmore was only beginning to show its shape. The Seaview's lounge was a room that had once known grandeur. Its tall windows, now dulled by salt spray, looked out across the restless grey of the Channel. Heavy curtains, drawn against the draught, gave the space a muffled, cloistered air. At the centre, a coal fire hissed and spat as though impatient with the chill that seeped through the walls. It was here, after luncheon, that the guests gathered, each with a teacup or a cigarette, their voices lowered, but their glances sharp. Lady Cranley presided as though the lounge were her private drawing-room. Draped in widow's black, her diamonds glittering, she leaned forward with the confidence of a woman who considered her words authoritative. "Depend upon it," she declared, her voice cutting through the low murmur. "Miss Stanmore did not leave without purpose. She had money, quite a lot of it, I suspect, and wherever there is money, there are people who circle like vultures." Colonel Fortescue gave a short bark of laughter. "Money? Nonsense. She was a spinster on a pension, nothing more." "That is precisely what she wanted us to believe," Lady Cranley retorted. "Do you not recall how she always guarded that handbag of hers, never letting it out of reach? And the way she kept her room locked, even when she went down to dinner? No, Colonel, There was more to Miss Stanmore than met the eye. Across the room, Peter Latham sat hunched in a corner chair, his sketch-pad balanced on his knee. His pencil moved rapidly, though from the anxious twitch of his hand it was doubtful he captured more than abstract lines. At Lady Cranley's words he glanced up, colour draining from his face. Tuppence, who had chosen a chair within earshot, sipped her tea serenely, her eyes missing nothing. She leaned closer to Tommy and murmured, "Did you notice? Whenever money is mentioned, our young artist turns pale." Tommy raised his brows. Perhaps he owes her something, or borrowed more than was wise. Tuppence tapped her teaspoon against her saucer thoughtfully. Or perhaps he knows where that handbag is now. Their quiet exchange was interrupted by the entrance of one of the maids. She was a slight girl with nervous eyes, clutching a tray of scones as though it were a shield. As she passed behind Lady Cranley's chair, her words slipped out in a hurried whisper, as if she couldn't contain them. "Beg pardon, madam, but I heard it. Pacing. Someone pacing in Miss Stanmore's room last night, after everyone said she was gone." The tray rattled as she set it down, and Mr. Hargreaves, who had materialized with his usual silent tread, shot her a warning look. "That will do, Alice. We don't trouble our guests with idle fancies." But the damage was done. The remark lingered in the air like smoke, and eyes shifted uneasily towards one another. Lady Cranley pounced. "There, you see? Someone has been in her room, rummaging through her things. That handbag of hers is gone, I'll wager, and with it whatever fortune she hid." The Colonel gave an irritable grunt. "Idle gossip, all of it. The girl imagines things. Hotels are full of creaks and footsteps." "Perhaps," Tuppence said lightly, turning her gaze on him. "But it's remarkable how often those creaks lead to explanations. Did you by any chance see Miss Stanmore yesterday evening, Colonel?" His moustache bristled. "Certainly not. I had better things to do than prowl after spinsters. I was in my room writing letters." "Letters?" Tuppence repeated, her tone mild but her eyes keen. "Foreign letters, perhaps?" The Colonel stiffened. "Domestic. Perfectly domestic." It was Tommy who took up the thread, his voice casual. "Curious thing. Hargreaves mentioned to me that Miss Stanmore was a regular correspondent, always sending off envelopes with foreign stamps. I wonder who she was writing to." Peter Latham's pencil slipped, leaving a dark streak across the page. He closed the sketchbook hastily and rose. "If you'll excuse me, I think I'll take some air." Without another word, he fled through the French doors to the terrace, the wind catching them with a bang behind him. "Most peculiar," Lady Cranley pronounced, her voice rich with meaning. "Or perfectly natural," the Colonel countered. "Artists are jumpy creatures." But Tuppence, watching the empty chair, thought otherwise. Nervous sketches, evasive glances, and now this abrupt retreat. Something linked Peter Latham to Miss Stanmore, something he did not wish the others to know. The conversation resumed in fitful bursts, each guest dropping hints, each word weighed. Lady Cranley elaborated on her theory of hidden wealth, declaring she had once glimpsed Miss Stanmore at the post office withdrawing an unusually large sum. The Colonel ridiculed the idea, but did so with a vehemence that suggested more than scepticism. Tommy, leaning close, murmured, "Every one of them has a reason to hope she's gone. Money, secrets, reputation. They're all playing at innocence, but not one of them looks surprised." "And that," said Tuppence softly, "is what troubles me most." When the tea things were finally cleared, the lounge settled into a heavy silence. Outside, the mist had thickened, turning the garden into a blur of grey-green shapes. The fire hissed as though uneasy with the atmosphere it warmed. Tuppence rose, smoothing her skirt, her voice deliberately bright. "Such a dreary day. Perhaps someone will show me the East Wing. I hear it's unused, but I do love exploring old corners of buildings." Mr. Hargreaves almost dropped the ashtray he was carrying. "The East Wing is closed, madam. Quite unsafe. Dust, damp, and broken floorboards. Nothing there to interest you." But his hasty protest only made the silence deeper. Lady Cranley raised her brows, Colonel Fortescue's glare sharpened, and Tommy, catching Tuppence's eye, suppressed a grin. The manager had revealed more than he intended. As they left the lounge together, Tommy remarked, "You have a way of dropping a pebble and watching all the ripples." "And what did you see?" she asked. "That they're all keeping something back. But whether it's money, scandal, or just old grudges, I couldn't say. Not yet." Tuppence drew her shawl tighter as a draught swept down the corridor. Then we must keep asking questions. For one thing is clear, Miss Stanmore's disappearance has stirred up more than concern. It has stirred up fear. And as the couple walked on, the whispers in the lounge seemed to follow them, like faint echoes along the creaking passages of the Seaview Hotel. The storm that had threatened all afternoon finally arrived with a vengeance. By evening, the rain lashed against the windows of the Seaview, and the wind howled down the chimney with a sound like distant mourning. The sea itself was invisible behind the sheeting water, but its roar carried through the stone walls, relentless and merciless. In such weather, the corridors of the hotel seemed more haunted than ever. Shadows leapt in the flickering gaslight, floorboards creaked under unseen weight, and every gust through a cracked sash made the curtains twitch like startled things. It was in this setting that Tuppence, candle in hand, slipped once more into Miss Stanmore's deserted room. Tommy followed with a sigh of resignation, though he shut the door firmly behind them. "I'll grant you it's suspicious," he said, glancing about the chamber. "But what exactly do you expect to find that the police didn't?" "The police didn't look," Tuppence replied briskly. "They glanced, muttered something about a walk on the cliffs, and left, which is why it falls to us." Her eyes had already gone to the fireplace. The grate was cold, the ashes grey, but something about the disorder caught her attention. She knelt, brushing aside the cinders with a handkerchief. "There," she said softly. "Do you see? Paper, not entirely burnt." Together they retrieved a handful of charred fragments, laying them carefully upon the dressing table. The edges were curled and blackened, but some words still clung stubbornly to the scraps. By candlelight the letters emerged, jagged but legible. "Matter of the locket. Cannot risk exposure. Secrets must remain." Tuppence's eyes shone. "Blackmail, Tommy, or something very like it. A locket, secrets, and someone desperate enough to burn the evidence, and not thorough enough to finish the job." Tommy frowned at the fragments. "But whose secrets? Hers, or someone else's?" "That," Tuppence said with satisfaction, "is what we must discover." While she puzzled over the fragments, Tommy sought answers of a more practical kind. He tracked down Alice, the maid who had spoken of pacing footsteps. She stood nervously in the corridor, wringing her hands in her apron. "It weren't just footsteps, sir," she whispered. "I saw her. I did. Miss Stanmore herself. Just before supper she went out by the side door, shawl over her shoulders. Took the cliff path." Tommy's brows rose. "Alone?" "Yes, sir, alone. And the waves were fierce even then. I thought to myself, she'll be blown right off. But she went steady enough. Only—" The girl hesitated, colour draining from her cheeks. "Only not 10 minutes later, I passed the colonel on the same path. He was carrying a coil of rope." The words struck with weight. Tommy repeated them slowly. "A rope, and he gave no reason for being out in that weather?" Alice shook her head violently. "None, sir, but he looked grim. I slipped by quick." Tommy dismissed her gently but firmly, then returned to Tuppence with the news. She listened, tapping her chin with a thoughtful finger. "So, Miss Stanmore on the cliff path, and the colonel following with a rope. If that isn't suggestive, I don't know what is." "Suggestive, yes," Tommy allowed. "Conclusive, no. The man might have been off to rescue seaweed for all we know." Tuppence laughed softly. "My dear, only you could invent so charitable a notion. No, there's more to it. A locket, secrets, a letter burned in haste, and a retired officer stalking the cliffs with rope. It paints a picture." The following morning, when the storm had abated enough to permit walking, they took the path themselves. The air was raw and briny, the rocks slick with rain. Below, the sea surged and foamed, waves crashing into hollows with a force that made the ground tremble. Tuppence paused at a bend where the path narrowed treacherously. "Here. This is where she might have fallen. One push, even one stumble, and nothing but the sea to catch you." They stood in silence a moment, listening to the vast thunder of water below. Then Tommy pointed to a patch of earth near the edge. "Look, fresh prints, not more than a day old." Tuppence bent. "2 sets, one small, hers perhaps, the other larger. Boots. The colonel's." "Could be," Tommy admitted, "but we can't accuse a man of murder on the strength of footprints and a coil of rope." "And yet," Tuppence said, straightening, "the image lingers, doesn't it? He follows her, prepared. She confronts him about the locket. There's a struggle. She goes over. The idea hung in the salt air, dreadfully plausible. When they returned to the hotel, the Colonel was in the lounge, puffing furiously on his pipe. His manner was as brusque as ever, but there was a tautness to his jaw, a way his eyes flickered whenever the cliffs were mentioned. Tuppence, settling gracefully into a chair, addressed him with deceptive casualness. "Colonel, I hear you favour evening walks. Brave of you, with the wind so high." He shot her a sharp look. "A man must have exercise." "With rope?" she added sweetly. His moustache bristled. "For climbing, madam. I take my constitutionals where others would not dare. Rope is precaution, not evidence of crime." Lady Cranley, who had been listening avidly, gave a dramatic gasp. "Evidence of crime? My dear Colonel, surely you don't mean—" "I mean nothing of the sort," he snapped, rising so abruptly his chair toppled, "and I'll thank you all to keep your foolish conjectures to yourselves." He stalked from the lounge, leaving a wake of silence. Tommy murmured, "If ever a man wished to look guilty, he's found the way." "Or," said Tuppence thoughtfully, "he's hiding something else entirely." That night the fragments of the letter still lay upon the dressing-table in Miss Stanmore's room. Tuppence returned to them once more, arranging the pieces like a puzzle. Her lips moved as she whispered the words again. "The matter of the locket. Secrets must remain." And outside, the sea pounded the cliffs, as though insisting that secrets, once loosed, could never be reclaimed. It was late when the thought seized Tuppence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a moon that cast a pale wash of silver over the grounds of the Seaview Hotel. The corridors within, however, were hushed and dim. Gas lamps turned low to economize, their glow forming pockets of light that only deepened the shadows. Tuppence sat up in bed, restless. The letter fragments, the locket, the footprints on the cliff path, each piece circled her mind like fragments of a jigsaw with one corner missing. And then her gaze fell to the door at the far end of their corridor, closed off by a faded rope barrier and a polite but insistent sign, "East wing closed, repairs in progress." She nudged Tommy awake. "Tommy, are you asleep?" "I was," came the muffled reply. "Good, because then you'll be fresh enough to accompany me." He groaned, rolling over. "To the land of Nod?" "To the east wing," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with resolve. Minutes later the pair stood at the barrier, a single candle between them. The wax guttered in the draught, casting their faces into alternating light and shadow. "This is your idea of a seaside holiday," Tommy muttered. "Adventure, Tommy," she countered cheerfully. "And if my instincts are correct, more truth is hidden in these dusty rooms than in the lounge downstairs." She unhooked the rope, and they stepped into silence. The east wing had the atmosphere of a place abandoned long before any repairmen arrived. Dust lay thick on the banisters, cobwebs draped themselves across corners, and the wallpaper curled away like dried leaves. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, louder than they ought, as though the walls themselves had been starved of sound. They passed door after door, most shut fast, some ajar to reveal glimpses of rooms stripped of furniture, or filled with sheet-draped shapes like ghosts at a banquet. The candlelight quivered across faded gilt mirrors and stained carpets, and then Tuppence stopped, crouching low. "Tommy, look." On the floor, where dust should have lain undisturbed, a trail of footprints cut sharply across, not the scurry of rats or the drag of workmen's boots, but neat, deliberate steps. Recent. Tommy frowned. "So someone else has been wandering where they ought not." "Precisely," Tuppence said softly. "We are not alone." They followed the prints to a half-closed door at the corridor's end. A draught stirred from the crack, carrying with it a faint smell of damp and something more intimate, lavender powder, lingering and out of place. Tuppence's heart quickened. She pushed, and the door creaked reluctantly open. Inside, the room was bare, save for a dressing-table pushed against the wall, and on it, absurdly out of place amidst the dust, lay a handbag. Not just any handbag, Miss Beatrice Stanmore's. Tuppence crossed the room quickly, lifting it with gloved fingers. The clasp snapped open easily. Inside was no money, no letters, no key, only a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, folded neatly as though waiting for their absent owner to reclaim them. "She didn't leave voluntarily," Tuppence whispered. She couldn't, not without these. Tommy's expression grew grim. Then someone wanted us to believe she did. Took her money, perhaps, but not her necessities. They stood in silence, the candle throwing long, uncertain shadows across the bare walls. And then, a sound. From the corridor outside, a soft scrape like a shoe brushing against wood. Tommy extinguished the candle at once, plunging them into darkness. They stood frozen, listening. Another step, then another. Slow, deliberate. Tuppence's breath caught. She edged to the doorway, peering out into the dim length of corridor. At the far end, silhouetted against the faint moonlight seeping through a cracked window, stood a figure. Tall, indistinct, motionless. For a heartbeat it remained. Then, with startling swiftness, it moved. Not towards them, but away. Gliding into shadow, vanishing round the corner. "After them," Tuppence urged, her whisper fierce. But when they reached the turn, the corridor stretched ahead, empty. Doors stood silent on either side. The silence pressed close, broken only by the thud of their own hearts. Tommy swore under his breath. Ghosts or not, that was human. Someone knows we're prowling. "And someone has been keeping Miss Stanmore's belongings here," Tuppence added. She clutched the handbag tighter, its weight suddenly ominous. "Which means she never left this hotel. Not alive." They made their way back with more haste than dignity, the candle flame sputtering. Behind them the east wing seemed to breathe, its shadows deepening as though swallowing what secrets had been glimpsed. Back in their room they laid the handbag on the bed. The spectacles gleamed faintly in the lamplight, mute testimony to absence. Tommy broke the silence. "We ought to confront Hargreaves, demand to know who has access to that wing." Tuppence shook her head. "Not yet. If we accuse too soon, we'll drive the fox deeper into its den. No, we must watch and wait. Whoever left that bag there will come back for it, and when they do, we shall be ready." Her resolve was firm, but even as she spoke, the unease remained. The silhouette had been no trick of the light, no accident. Someone else was prowling those corridors with intent, and perhaps not merely to conceal the fate of Miss Stanmore. That night, as the waves thundered once more against the cliffs and the old hotel groaned in the wind, Tommy and Tuppence lay awake longer than they admitted. The east wing seemed to press upon their thoughts, heavy with dust and silence and the shadow of a vanished woman. The morning broke cold and bright, the storm having scrubbed the air clear. Sunlight streamed across the channel, setting the waves sparkling like fractured glass. But within the Seaview Hotel, the atmosphere remained heavy, every conversation in the dining room taut with unspoken speculation. Tommy, seated at a corner table with pen in hand, had taken to treating the whole affair as a military exercise. Before him lay a folded sheet of hotel stationery on which he was assembling a list, neat and methodical. At the top he wrote, "Suspects in the disappearance of Miss Beatrice Stanmore." He underlined it with a flourish. Below, in numbered order, he began to set out the names. Lady Cranley, possible financial motive. Interested in Stanmore's handbag, hinted at hidden money. Contradictory statements. Colonel Fortescue, rope on the cliffs. Feared exposure of something in his past. Volatile temper. Peter Latham, the artist. Nervous. Obsession with Stanmore's locket. Too quick to flee conversations. Tommy leaned back, satisfied. There we are. The field of battle arranged. Now we simply maneuver until someone shows their hand. Tuppence, buttering toast with deliberate precision, arched an eyebrow. "Your lists always look neat at the start, Tommy, but it's the ink smudges and blots later on that make them interesting. Shall we begin smudging?" Her chance came sooner than expected. Lady Cranley swept into the lounge later that morning, diamonds flashing in the sunlight that streamed across the threadbare carpet. She carried herself with the certainty of one accustomed to directing conversations. "My dears," she began, lowering herself into a chair with theatrical grace, "I hardly slept a wink last night. The very idea that we should harbour a disappearance under this roof is intolerable. I only saw Miss Stanmore—" She paused dramatically. "Why, only the afternoon before last near the post office." Tuppence leaned forward, her expression guileless. "How curious, Lady Cranley. Only yesterday you mentioned the last time you saw her was at luncheon in the dining room." For a moment the widow faltered, her smile brittle. "Did I? Perhaps I misremembered. These things blur together when one is distressed." "Of course," Tuppence said sweetly, but her eyes met Tommy's across the table, and the unspoken message was clear. A contradiction noted, a thread to be tugged. Colonel Fortescue was less subtle. Cornered by Tommy later in the smoking room, he blustered at once. Dashed nonsense, all this talk of blackmail. Stanmore was a harmless old maid, took her walks, wrote her letters, minding her own business. Letters to whom, I wonder? Tommy asked mildly. The Colonel's moustache bristled. Foreign correspondence, I suppose. She had her fancies. Nothing criminal in that. Unless, Tommy said softly, someone feared what she might write about them. The Colonel's pipe snapped between his teeth, the stem cracking in two. Careful, Beresford. A man of my service doesn't take kindly to insinuation. Yet his reaction was precisely that, an overreaction. Tommy noted it with the cool detachment of a man adding another blot of ink to his page. Peter Latham proved another puzzle. They found him in the garden, sketching furiously, his hands smudged with charcoal. The drawing on his lap was not of the cliffs, nor the sea, but of a delicate oval shape, a locket rendered again and again in frantic repetition. Tuppence bent over his shoulder. That's very pretty. Whose locket is it meant to be? The young man flushed scarlet. No one's, just a design, a study of form. Yet I could swear, Tuppence murmured, that Miss Stanmore wore just such a piece around her neck. I remember it catching the light at dinner. Peter's hand jerked, smudging the charcoal. He snapped the sketchbook shut. You're mistaken. Entirely mistaken. And he strode off towards the terrace, leaving behind the scent of turpentine and panic. By luncheon, the air was thick with speculation once more. The guests whispered behind folded newspapers, and even the staff moved with a distracted air, their eyes sharp, their tongues sharp too. The Seaview Hotel had become a hive of mistrust, each corridor an avenue of secrets. It was the shopkeeper who added a new piece to the puzzle. Tuppence, slipping into the village that afternoon under the pretext of needing stamps, lingered at the counter while the woman in the apron fetched her change. Strange business about Miss Stanmore, the shopkeeper said with relish, and after she'd bought that fine notebook only last week. Leather-bound it was, and she said she'd fill it with things that mattered. Always wrote a lot, she did, letters and such. Tuppence's interest sharpened. A notebook, you say? Did she leave it here for repair, perhaps? The woman shook her head. No, madam. Took it with her. Haven't seen it since. Funny, though, she looked over her shoulder when she bought it, as if she didn't want anyone to know. That's why I remember. On her return, Tuppence found Tommy in the lounge, still with his list. She laid the new intelligence before him like a trump card. A missing notebook, she said, filled with things that mattered. I dare say if we find it, we find half the answers. Tommy tapped his pen thoughtfully. So, our suspects stand thus. Lady Cranley, who may covet money that wasn't hers. The Colonel, with secrets from his past that Stanmore might have unearthed. And young Latham, who can't stop sketching a locket she owned. And now, this notebook, which could damn any or all of them. And which, Tuppence added, is conveniently nowhere to be found. That evening, the lounge again became a stage. Lady Cranley fluttered dramatically, the Colonel barked contradictions, and Peter Latham avoided everyone's gaze. Through it all, Tuppence steered conversations with practised charm, slipping in questions that seemed casual but landed like barbs. How generous Miss Stanmore must have been, always writing letters abroad, she said at one point. One wonders what confidences she shared. Confidences? Nonsense, the Colonel snapped, reddening. A woman like that had nothing worth confiding. But perhaps she knew something of others, Tuppence suggested, her tone mild as cream. The Colonel muttered into his glass, and Lady Cranley, unusually pale, reached for her fan, though the room was hardly warm. It was a game of chess, as Tommy later described it. Each piece moved, each reaction measured. Every revelation shifted suspicion, every inconsistency another hint that beneath the polished veneer of seaside respectability lives tangled in envy, fear, and desperation. By the firelight, Tuppence whispered, "We have the board set, Tommy, but the next move belongs to our opponent, and I dare say it will not be a gentle one." And beyond the windows the sea roared in the night, as though echoing the unrest within the walls of the Seaview Hotel. The sea had never looked more merciless. Its surface, though calm at dawn, had gathered strength by mid-morning, each swell rising like the shoulder of some great beast, only to crash against the cliffs in a white frenzy. Tommy and Tuppence stood with the other guests by the seawall, where the spray leapt high enough to sting their cheeks. The word had spread quickly. Something had been found. A fisherman, hat jammed low against the wind, stood before the small crowd, a sodden scrap of cloth clutched in his calloused hand. "Caught on the rocks below," he said grimly. "Nearly went into the drink trying to fetch it out." He held it up, and the colours, though blurred by seawater, were unmistakable. A delicate silk scarf, patterned in pale roses and blue forget-me-nots. Lady Cranley gave a shrill cry. "Her scarf! I told you the sea had taken her." The Colonel muttered something under his breath and turned away, but his hand trembled as he lit his pipe. Tommy studied the scarf carefully. "It might be hers," he admitted, "but it proves nothing beyond the fact that it's here now." Colonel Fortescue, Peter Latham and Mr. Hargreaves faced them in a half-circle, each unwilling but compelled to sit. The air was heavy with expectancy, a courtroom atmosphere conjured in the shell of a seaside hotel. Tommy began, his tone measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have danced around this matter long enough. Tonight we shall have truth. Miss Beatrice Stanmore did not vanish into thin air, nor did the sea claim her by chance. She was silenced." Lady Cranley let out a sharp gasp. The Colonel shifted uneasily, his moustache twitching as though to growl its own protest. Peter Latham merely lowered his head, his sketchbook clutched like a shield. Tuppence's voice followed, quiet but piercing. "We have before us her notebook, a ledger of confidences, each one enough to wound a reputation, ruin a career, or expose a lie. It was her habit to collect secrets, and secrets are dangerous things, dangerous for those who keep them, and deadly for those who threaten to reveal them." Tommy stepped forward, his gaze steady on the Colonel. "Colonel Fortescue, your name appears in the book. Supplies mislaid in India, accusations never proved. Old history, perhaps, yet enough to mar a distinguished retirement if aired afresh. Did Miss Stanmore threaten to remind the world?" The Colonel flushed scarlet, fists tightening on the arms of his chair. "Rotten rumour. She scribbled what she pleased. I never gave the woman a thought." "Perhaps not," Tommy allowed, "but your temper, Colonel, makes you an easy suspect. Rope on the cliffs, anger in your voice. Yet no murder lies in that, merely bluster." The Colonel subsided, though not without a muttered oath. Tuppence turned next to Peter. "And you, Mr. Latham, the locket. Page after page she wrote of it, and of you. Your attachment to her, your debts, your obsession. You skulked with lantern and spade, muttering of burying the past. It would be all too easy to imagine you silencing her in desperation." Peter's hands trembled. "I loved her," he whispered hoarsely. "She listened to me when no one else would. She understood. I only wanted to keep her memory safe." "Memory," Tuppence echoed softly, "not her person, which tells me you grieved, Mr. Latham, but grief is not guilt." His head bowed lower, his tears genuine. Now Tommy turned his gaze to Mr. Hargreaves. The manager's spectacles glinted as he dabbed nervously at his brow. "You also appear in the ledger," Tommy said. "Mismanaged accounts, indiscretions best left unspoken. Did Miss Stanmore use your weakness as leverage? Did you silence her to preserve your livelihood?" Hargreaves shook his head violently. No. I may have borrowed once or twice, but never more. I feared exposure, yes, but murder? I am not capable of such a thing." Tuppence's eyes narrowed. Perhaps not capable, but certainly fearful. Fear enough to help conceal, if not to commit. The man buried his face in his hands, trembling, and then Tommy's voice shifted, sharper, commanding. "Which leaves us, inevitably, Lady Cranley." The widow stiffened, her pearls glittering in the lantern light. "How dare you?" "How dare we?" Tommy repeated softly. "Because your entry was most damning. Your late husband's estate ruined, his name salvaged only by the charity of friends. Embezzlement, money shifted, hidden. Miss Stanmore knew. She underlined your name." Lady Cranley rose, her voice shrill. "Lies! Lies scribbled by a spiteful old maid. I never gave her two thoughts." But Tuppence stepped closer, her voice quiet, deadly. "And yet you argued with her." The maid heard pacing in Miss Stanmore's room the night she vanished. Your voice was raised, your footsteps furious, and when she threatened to expose you, your husband's reputation, your own comfort, you struck. Lady Cranley's fan snapped in her hand, splintering. This is monstrous. You hid her body in the east wing, Tuppence pressed on. For a time it lay there while you contrived evidence to suggest the sea had claimed her. You planted the scarf on the rocks. You watched while the inspector closed his file. But the notebook, the notebook was your undoing. You could not burn it fast enough. The room was hushed but for the roar of the sea outside. At last Lady Cranley gave a low, broken laugh. You clever children. Yes, I silenced her. Do you know what it is to build a life upon appearances, to hold your head high while the world whispers behind its gloves? She threatened to drag my husband's name into the dirt, to undo everything I had preserved. I could not allow it. Her voice rose, bitter and fierce. I went to her that night. She mocked me, waving the locket, speaking of money owed, of debts to be collected. I struck her. I did not mean to, but she fell, so slight, so frail. Her head upon the floor. She shuddered, pressing trembling hands to her face. I dragged her to the east wing, hid her in an empty room while I thought what to do. The storm gave me my chance. I placed the scarf where the sea would carry it, let them all believe she had gone to her death. It would have worked, if not for you. Silence followed her words, stark and terrible. Even Colonel Fortescue seemed subdued, his bluster drowned by the enormity of her confession. Peter wept openly. Mr. Hargreaves sat with head bowed, his hands trembling in his lap. Tommy's voice broke the stillness. And so, Lady Cranley, you traded one scandal for another. The sea does not always keep secrets. At that moment, the door opened, and the inspector entered with 2 constables at his back. Tuppence had sent for them earlier, knowing the hour of revelation was at hand. Lady Cranley straightened, dignity asserting itself even in ruin. Very well, take me. But remember this. Had you been in my place with everything you had ever fought for about to be stripped away, you might have done the same. No, Tuppence said softly. I might have chosen honesty or humility, but never murder. The constables led her out, her figure proud despite the chains of guilt that bound her. Dawn broke as they stepped onto the terrace, the sky painted in pale pinks and greys, the sea at last at peace. The gulls wheeled once more, indifferent heralds of a new day. Tommy slipped his arm around Tuppence. Well, partner, another seaside holiday successfully ruined. Shall we go home? She leaned against him with a weary smile. Yes, Tommy, home. Though I confess, there is something exhilarating about the truth finally stepping out of the shadows. And as the first light of morning touched the old hotel, the Seaview seemed to sigh, its secrets at last released into the open air. Morning broke clear and still, as though the night's drama had been nothing but a fevered dream. The sea stretched out in dazzling serenity, a great mirror of sunlight broken only by the silver sweep of gulls. The cliffs, washed clean by rain, stood stark and unyielding, betraying no hint of the secrets they had so nearly kept. Within the Seaview Hotel, the hush of dawn was broken not by whispers of suspicion, but by the muted sounds of trunks being strapped and bags carried down narrow staircases. Guests who had arrived full of holiday cheer, or in some cases thinly veiled pretensions, now departed with subdued expressions chastened by the ordeal. Lady Cranley's room was already shuttered, her presence erased save for the faint perfume that lingered in the corridors. Colonel Fortescue barked orders at the porter with unnecessary force, his bluster a poor disguise for relief. Peter Latham shuffled about with his sketchbook pressed to his chest, as though guarding what scraps of dignity he had left. Even Mr. Hargreaves, the manager, seemed reduced, his immaculate suit crumpled, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he personally attended to departures. Tommy and Tuppence, however, remained unhurried. They sat together in the lounge, where the fire had burned down to embers and the morning light spilled through the tall windows, gilding the worn furniture with sudden grace. Before them lay a tray of tea and buttered rolls, steam curling lazily from the pot. Tuppence cradled her cup, her gaze fixed upon the sea beyond the glass. It always astonishes me, Tommy, how quickly life resumes its pace. Yesterday the hotel was alive with whispers. Each corridor seemed to breathe with menace, and today it is nothing but a respectable seaside establishment once more. Tommy buttered a roll with care. Respectable, yes, though its reputation may require a little polishing before the summer crowd descends. People are squeamish about hotels that come with corpses in the East Wing. Tuppence gave a faint laugh. And yet it is never the sea, nor the storm, nor the cliffs that bring about the downfall. It is always people, vanity, secrets, fear. That is what toppled Lady Cranley. Tommy leaned back, his expression thoughtful. She played her part rather well, you must admit. I half expected her to bluff it out to the very end. But in the end, guilt has a way of forcing its own confession. Tuppence stirred her tea. And poor Miss Stanmore. She fancied herself mistress of secrets, but it was the very collection of them that destroyed her. I wonder, did she think herself invulnerable, or merely clever enough to manage the strings she tied around others? Neither clever nor invulnerable, Tommy said, reaching for his cup. Just human, and humans are remarkably poor at weighing the cost of silence against the peril of truth. The clock on the mantel ticked solemnly, marking the steady retreat of the storm into memory. At length Tuppence leaned back with a sigh. It is a curious thing, Tommy. One cannot help but see the comedy tucked inside the tragedy. Pearls scattered on the carpet, the colonel roaring like a wounded bull, the artist trembling with unspoken declarations. If the stakes had not been so grave, it would have been a farce worthy of the theatre. Tommy smiled wryly. That is the trouble with crime, my dear. It balances always upon that thin line. One step toward comedy, the other toward catastrophe. They drank in companionable silence for a while, listening to the subdued stirrings of departure upstairs. Then Tuppence set down her cup with decision. Well, Tommy, I suppose this is what one might call a holiday of mixed blessings. We had sea air, brisk walks, and rather dreadful fish pies. We also had murder, blackmail, and lantern chases along storm-slick cliffs. Perhaps next time we might choose a destination with fewer opportunities for bodies. Tommy chuckled. You forget, Tuppence, that wherever we go, mischief has a curious knack for following. If we were to visit the Sahara, I dare say we should stumble upon a skeleton with a note clutched in its bony hand. And you, she retorted, would be scribbling suspects upon a camel's saddle while I arranged an interview with the oasis keeper. They laughed together, the sound light against the heavy silence that lingered elsewhere in the hotel. By mid-morning, the Seaview was nearly empty. Trunks had been dispatched, cars stood waiting at the gravel drive, and the last of the guests made their polite farewells with the air of people anxious never to cross paths again. The inspector, returning briefly to tidy up official matters, tipped his hat to Tommy and Tuppence with reluctant respect. You've a knack for this sort of business, he admitted. Not that I approve of amateurs meddling, but you saw what I missed. Truth be told, I shan't mind if you take your deductions somewhere else next season. Tommy grinned. Don't worry, Inspector. We've no plans to monopolise the seaside. Plenty of mysteries inland. When the inspector had gone, Tuppence rose, smoothing her skirt. The sunlight caught her hair, and for a moment she looked younger, almost carefree. Shall we? She asked. They stepped out onto the terrace. The sea glittered, innocent once more, the tide sweeping in with lazy gentleness. The cliffs stood stark and silent, concealing what they had witnessed, while gulls wheeled overhead in bright, careless arcs. Tommy drew a long breath of salt air. Strange, isn't it? The world insists on going about its business, no matter what dramas play out along its shores. Tuppence slipped her arm through his. Yes, and perhaps that is as it should be. After all, the calm must return. Otherwise, we should never endure the storms. They stood together a moment longer, letting the sunlight warm their faces. Then, with one last glance back at the weather-beaten facade of the Seaview Hotel, its shutters rattling gently, its windows gleaming as though newly polished, they descended the steps, their footsteps crunching upon the gravel drive. The car awaited, engine purring softly, ready to bear them back to London, to routine, and perhaps to another adventure waiting just beyond the horizon. As they settled inside, Tuppence gave a final, wistful smile. Goodbye, Seaview. You've given us a story we shall not soon forget. And as the motor car rolled away, the hotel receded into the bright distance, restored to its calm, yet forever changed, its faded halls still whispering of secrets, its walls holding the memory of a woman undone by her own desperate grasp at dignity, and the couple who had drawn the truth into the light. The sea sparkled, the gulls cried, and life, as it always did, carried on. The local inspector, summoned once more, seemed relieved to have a tangible object in hand. "Clear enough," he announced. "The lady must have walked too close to the edge in that storm. A slip, a gust of wind, down she went. The sea does the rest." "And this," Lady Cranley declared, her voice quavering with the satisfaction of vindication, "is the tragic proof. Poor woman, though I dare say she should have known better at her age." Tuppence's eyes narrowed. She took the scarf gently, her gloved fingers probing the fabric. At the hem she found a knot, an unnatural twist, as though it had been deliberately tied before being tossed into the waves. "Or placed there," she murmured. "Not lost at all, but arranged to be found." Tommy glanced at her, half amused. "You'll be telling me next that someone stood on the cliff in a gale just to dangle a scarf on a rock." "I'm saying," Tuppence replied quietly, "that evidence which arrives so conveniently is rarely to be trusted." The inspector, however, was not to be swayed. He tucked the scarf into his pocket as though the matter were closed, muttered something about writing a report, and stumped off towards the village. By the time the party dispersed, the sun had already disappeared behind a bank of clouds. The wind picked up once more, scattering sand along the path and setting the hotel's shutters to banging. Inside, the guests resumed their uneasy rituals. Lady Cranley poured herself a restorative sherry, Peter Latham buried himself in sketches that grew darker by the hour, and Colonel Fortescue snapped at the staff with renewed ferocity. Tommy was content to let them circle each other, but Tuppence's eyes remained sharp, watchful. That evening, as the lamps flickered in the lounge, she noticed Peter rising quietly from his chair, his sketchbook tucked under one arm. He slipped through the French doors onto the terrace, glancing left and right before disappearing into the darkness. "Tommy," Tuppence whispered, rising at once. "He's going to the cliffs." "Perhaps he wants fresh air." "With a lantern?" That settled it. They followed at a distance, the hotel falling behind them until only its windows glowed faintly against the night. The storm had returned with a vengeance. Clouds boiled overhead, blotting out the moon. The path down to the cliffs was slick, every stone treacherous beneath their feet. Ahead, Peter's lantern swung, casting erratic beams across the rocks. They crouched behind a boulder as he paused, setting the lantern down. His voice, though carried away by the wind, reached them in fragments. "Must be ended. Burying the past. No one must know." Tuppence gripped Tommy's arm. "You heard? Burying the past." Tommy's lips tightened. "Or burying evidence." Peter dropped to his knees, fumbling with something in the sand. Another gust of wind tore at him, nearly toppling the lantern. Thunder cracked overhead, a violent roar that set the sea heaving like a creature in pain. Tuppence shifted, trying to gain a better view. Her foot slipped on the wet stone and she stifled a cry. The sound was small, but Peter's head jerked up at once. "Who's there?" His voice cracked with fear. Tommy pulled Tuppence back, whispering, "Stay still." But Peter was already snatching up the lantern, its light swinging wildly. He stumbled up the path, not towards them but away, his silhouette jerking against the storm. Tommy and Tuppence gave chase. Rain pelted their faces, the ground a shifting hazard beneath them. At one turn the path narrowed alarmingly, slick with moss and seawater. Tuppence slipped, her heels sliding towards the edge. Tommy caught her with a desperate grip, hauling her back from the abyss. The sea roared below, so close it seemed ready to devour them. For a breathless moment they clung together, the lantern's glow already vanishing into the distance. "Well," Tuppence gasped, recovering her composure, "that was nearly the shortest investigation in history." Tommy's laugh was strained. "I'd rather solve mysteries on dry land, if it's all the same to you." When they reached the terrace again, Peter was nowhere to be seen. His lantern had vanished, and the storm swallowed all trace of him. Back in their room, dripping and dishevelled, they considered the evening's events. "He was burying something," Tuppence said firmly, "something that tied him to Miss Stanmore. The scarf was a distraction, meant to close the case. But Peter knows more. He's hiding it." Tommy, toweling his hair, nodded, and nearly broke his neck doing it. Whatever he fears being revealed must be serious. Tuppence crossed to the window, gazing out at the cliffs. Lightning lit the sea for an instant, stark and merciless. "We're circling closer, Tommy. Every step draws us nearer to the truth. But I fear the cliffs are not the only danger here. Someone is desperate enough to plant evidence, to prowl the east wing, to stalk the night. If we aren't careful, the next body claimed by the sea might be ours." Tommy joined her, his reflection in the glass pale against the storm. "Then we'll have to be more careful than ever. But one thing is certain, we're not leaving until we know what really happened to Miss Stanmore." The thunder rolled again, and the Seaview Hotel groaned in the wind, its walls seeming to close in with the weight of secrets still buried. The storm had blown itself out by dawn, leaving the Seaview Hotel hushed beneath a pewter-coloured sky. Puddles glistened in the gravel drive, gulls wheeled overhead with mournful cries, and the sea, though calmer, still bore the bruised look of a fighter not yet finished. Inside, the atmosphere was no less charged. Guests sat over breakfast in stiff silence, each pretending to read the morning paper, but in truth watching the others. Lady Cranley's diamonds seemed to sparkle all the more defiantly, while Colonel Fortescue scowled as though daring anyone to speak of scarves or cliffs. Peter Latham hunched low, sketching lines that turned into smudges more often than not. It was in this charged quiet that Tuppence slipped into conversation with Alice, the maid. The girl had been serving tea nervously, eyes darting as if fearful of reprimand. Tuppence, in her most companionable tone, beckoned her closer. "You must find this business as unsettling as the rest of us, Alice," she said gently. "Poor Miss Stanmore. Have you remembered anything more about her?" Alice hesitated, glancing towards the door as if to be sure they were unobserved. "She was particular, miss, always scribbling, not just letters. A little leather notebook she had, dark brown it was with a strap. She'd sit writing for hours, her hand flying as though she were afraid the words might escape." "A notebook?" Tuppence's eyes sharpened. "Yes, miss. She kept it close. Once I caught a glimpse when she left it on the bed. Names inside and lines written after. Secrets, I thought. Secrets about the people here." Tuppence laid a reassuring hand on the girl's arm. "You've been most helpful, Alice, and I shall not breathe a word of it to anyone else." The moment the maid departed, Tuppence leaned across to Tommy, her eyes alight. "Do you see? A notebook of secrets. That is the key." Tommy stirred his tea thoughtfully. "If it exists, someone has it now. And if Miss Stanmore was using it for blackmail, well, that gives everyone a motive." The day wore on, heavy with tension. At luncheon, Lady Cranley made an elaborate show of not mentioning Miss Stanmore, which only reminded everyone of her absence. The Colonel's pipe clattered irritably against his teeth, and Peter Latham excused himself halfway through the soup, muttering about light for his sketches, though the sky outside was as dull as pewter. It was late afternoon before Tommy and Tuppence ventured once more into the east wing. They carried a lantern this time, its glow steady against the gloom. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed by their steps, and the silence pressed close. "We've searched this wing once already," Tommy remarked. "What makes you think we'll find anything new?" "Because," Tuppence said firmly, "if Miss Stanmore treasured her notebook, she would have hidden it where she felt safe. And the handbag, remember, was found here. That tells me this is where her secrets were kept." They examined room after room, lifting loose boards, probing corners, peering into old cupboards where moths fluttered at their disturbance. At last, in a small chamber at the very end of the corridor, Tommy's boot struck something hollow beneath the warped floorboards. "Here," he said, crouching. With effort, he pried up a board, and from the dust beneath drew a slim object bound in dark leather. The notebook. Tuppence's breath caught. "Oh, Tommy, you've done it." They carried it back to their own room before daring to open it. The pages, though smudged and hurried, were filled with neat lines of writing. Each began with a name, familiar names. Lady Cranley, Colonel Fortescue, Peter Latham, even Mr. Hargreaves, the hotel manager. After each name, terse notes, observations, secrets. Tuppence read aloud in hushed tones. Lady C, husband's estate heavily mortgaged, gambled in clubs, hushed up by friends. She turned a page. Fortescue, incident in India. Supplies missing, accusations buried, bitter letter from former comrade. Another page. Latham, obsession with portrait sitter, money borrowed, unpaid, locket, evidence of attachment. She closed the book slowly. So she knew. She knew everything, and she wrote it down. Tommy whistled. Well, well, our Miss Stanmore was not merely a spinster with a taste for seaside air. She was a collector of secrets, and secrets are a dangerous currency. They pored over the notebook for an hour, noting how each guest was implicated. Some entries were ambiguous, others damning. Lady Cranley's finances were shakier than her glittering diamonds suggested. The Colonel's military past held shadows. Latham's infatuation bordered on obsession, and the mention of the locket, always the locket, cropped up more than once. And notice this, Tuppence pointed. Some entries trail off as though she never finished, or perhaps she was interrupted. Tommy tapped the cover. If she used this to exert influence, someone might have reached their limit. Blackmail, even hinted at, is enough to push a desperate person to violence. As evening fell, the hotel gathered once more in the lounge. The fire burned low, shadows leaping high against the walls. Tuppence and Tommy sat apart, watching, weighing. Lady Cranley fanned herself needlessly, colour high in her cheeks. The Colonel glowered into his glass, every muscle rigid. Peter Latham sketched distractedly, his eyes darting towards Tuppence whenever he thought she wasn't looking. In their minds, each guest now bore a new weight, the burden of what Miss Stanmore had known about them. Tuppence leaned closer to Tommy. Red herrings, perhaps, but one of these entries is more than idle scribbling. One of them was the lever she meant to use, and the lever that broke her neck. Tommy's reply was grim. Then our task is to discover which. Until then, we're all pieces on her chessboard, even from beyond the grave. And in the silence that followed, the sea thundered faintly in the distance, as though reminding them that secrets, once stirred, could not be buried forever. The Seaview Hotel was no stranger to storms, but on that particular evening the tempest came not from the sea, but from within. The lounge, usually a place of stifled yawns and bridge games, bristled with an undercurrent of tension so sharp one could almost hear it crackle. The fire sputtered low in the grate, casting restless shadows, and the great brass clock upon the mantel ticked with ominous deliberation, as though it knew that time for concealment was nearly over. Tommy sat at the edge of the circle of chairs, notebook in hand. He had chosen the position with the precision of a general, commanding the room while pretending to scribble casually. Tuppence, poised and bright-eyed, occupied the chair beside him. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, but her posture conveyed the stillness of a hunter ready to spring. Around them the suspects gathered like pieces on a chessboard. Lady Cranley, wrapped in black silk and self-importance, fingers endlessly fluttering at her pearls. Colonel Fortescue, stiff-backed and red-faced, glaring at the world as though he could cow it into submission. Peter Latham, pale, his sketchbook clasped to his chest, as though it alone kept him upright. And Mr. Hargreaves, the hotel manager, hovering with nervous civility near the drinks cabinet, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight. Tuppence let the silence stretch, savouring the anticipation. Then she spoke, her tone light, almost conversational. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think it is only fair that we put an end to speculation. Tommy and I have, quite by chance, come across something of interest." Heads turned, eyes sharpened. "A notebook," Tuppence continued, "a rather remarkable little book belonging to Miss Stanmore." The reaction was immediate. Lady Cranley gave a sharp gasp and clutched her pearls as though to still their betraying rattle. The Colonel's pipe slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the fender, scattering ash. Peter Latham turned the colour of whey, his hands trembling so violently that his sketchbook nearly slid from his lap. "A notebook?" Mr. Hargreaves echoed faintly. Of what consequence could that be?" "Oh, of enormous consequence," Tuppence said sweetly. "Because Miss Stanmore, it seems, had a most particular habit. She liked to write things down. Names, details, secrets." The silence deepened until even the fire seemed to hush. Tommy raised his head, his voice deliberate. "To be plain, the notebook is a catalogue of confidences, financial missteps, indiscretions, debts, scandals long buried. Each of you is mentioned." Colonel Fortescue surged to his feet, his voice a roar. "Libel! Utter libel! How dare you make such an accusation?" Tommy's gaze was steady. "Sit down, Colonel. No one has named you guilty of anything, yet. But the book is thorough, and it spares no one." Lady Cranley fanned herself furiously. "This is monstrous. The poor woman is scarcely cold," she faltered, catching herself. "That is to say, scarcely gone from us, and you dare to drag her reputation through the mud?" Tuppence's eyes gleamed. "Her reputation, Lady Cranley, or yours?" The widow's lips pinched, colour rising. She smoothed her skirt with trembling hands. It was Peter Latham, however, who betrayed himself most plainly. He had sunk low in his chair, his eyes darting from face to face as though seeking escape. His lips moved silently, repeating words no one could hear. Tuppence leaned forward, her voice suddenly sharper. "There is one more point of interest. Among the names in that book, one was underlined, boldly, emphatically. It would seem Miss Stanmore considered that entry of particular importance." The room froze. Lady Cranley's pearls slipped from her fingers, scattering in a soft cascade onto the carpet. The Colonel's fists clenched until the knuckles whitened. But it was Peter who spoke, his voice breaking. "She never should have written about me." The words hung in the air, stark and irrevocable. A gasp rippled through the room. Lady Cranley sagged against her chair, the Colonel swore under his breath, and even Hargreaves looked as though he might faint. Tuppence's eyes sharpened. "Ah," she said softly, "so you admit you are underlined." Peter's face twisted, pale and desperate. She misunderstood. The locket, it wasn't what she thought. "I never meant—" But he got no further. At that instant the lamps sputtered, flared, and went out. Darkness fell, sudden and absolute. Someone screamed. A chair overturned with a crash. The sound of hurried movement, footsteps pounding, fabric tearing, echoed through the blackness. "Keep still," Tommy shouted. "Nobody move!" But his command was swallowed in the chaos. Lady Cranley cried out that she was suffocating. The Colonel bellowed orders as though to invisible troops, and glass shattered somewhere in the dark. Tuppence rose swiftly, her hand brushing Tommy's. "The fuse box," she hissed. "Quickly!" They stumbled into the corridor, guided only by the faint glow of a storm lantern hanging on the far wall. Behind them the lounge seethed with confusion. Tommy found the fuse box at last and fumbled with the catch. A spark flared, the lights blazed back to life. When they returned to the lounge, the scene was chaos incarnate. Chairs were overturned, Lady Cranley's pearls scattered like hailstones across the carpet, the Colonel red-faced and shouting. Peter Latham stood by the French doors, his sketchbook fallen to the floor, his face a mask of terror. "What happened?" Tommy demanded. "No one left," Lady Cranley cried hysterically. "I swear it, no one. But the lights, they went out, and someone pushed past me." Tuppence stooped swiftly, retrieving Peter's sketchbook. Its cover was smeared, as though from damp hands, and several pages had been ripped free. "You were trying to destroy something," she said quietly, fixing Peter with a steady gaze. He shook his head wildly. "No, she wrote lies, all lies. I couldn't bear." "Then why tear out the pages?" His mouth worked, but no words came. Tommy glanced around the room. The widow still clutched at her pearls with shaking hands. The Colonel fumed and spluttered, pipe smoke billowing about him. Hargreaves wrung his hands near the mantel, his eyes darting to the shadows as though he expected them to spring alive. The atmosphere was electric, brittle with fear and fury. They had baited the trap, and it had sprung, though not yet to conclusion. Tuppence set the sketchbook down, her voice calm but edged. "Ladies and gentlemen, the time for evasions is over. Someone here silenced Miss Stanmore because she knew too much, and tonight someone tried to silence her notebook. But the truth, like the tide, has a way of returning." For a moment no one spoke. Only the steady tick of the brass clock marked the silence. Then Colonel Fortescue slammed his fist against the mantel. "Damn it all, Beresford, this is intolerable. Either you produce this so-called notebook or admit you're bluffing." Tommy smiled faintly. "A general never reveals his full hand before the decisive moment, Colonel. But rest assured, we have all we need." The Colonel glared, his face a storm cloud of suspicion. Lady Cranley looked away, her fan trembling in her hand, and Peter sank once more into his chair, his head in his hands, a picture of defeat. The trap had been set, the lines drawn, and though the lights had betrayed them for a moment, The guilty party had flinched. Tuppence met Tommy's eyes across the wreckage of the lounge, her expression both resolute and wary. "We're close now," she murmured, "closer than ever. But the most dangerous game is always at the end." And beyond the windows, the sea roared against the cliffs, as though applauding the drama that unfolded within the crumbling walls of the Seaview Hotel. The Seaview Hotel lay shrouded in darkness once more. The earlier chaos had left nerves frayed, tempers ragged, and every guest looking over their shoulder. At Tommy's insistence, they reconvened in the great lounge, though not with its usual glow of polished lamps. Only lanterns had been lit, their amber circles of light casting long, leaping shadows across the faded wallpaper. It was close upon midnight. Outside, the sea thundered against the cliffs as though determined to lend its own accompaniment. Inside, the stage was set for revelation. Tuppence stood near the fire, hands folded lightly, her eyes watchful. Tommy moved deliberately, arranging the chairs so that the suspects, Lady Cranley,